colleagues, on behalf of the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, in short FACT Alliance, at the Abdul Latif Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab at MIT, on behalf of my own organization, BOKU University in Vienna and CIFOR-ICRAF in Nairobi, a very warm welcome to our webinar, Climate Change and Water, and that big question that follows: Are we doing enough? My name is Michael Hauser. I'm the co-host of this webinar series together with Greg Sixt, whom I'll introduce in a second. But let's turn to water first. Well, I guess many of us on this call take water for granted. Well, I do. And we only start valuing it when it's getting scarce, or when it's getting overwhelming by the way it disrupts our supply chains, it damages our infrastructure, it causes conflict, now water-related conflicts. And as with foods, the relation between water and conflict are fairly complex. And this is one thing we want to discuss in this webinar today. But let's share a few examples. I think it's pretty clear that conflicts do have an impact on water. Just look at what's happening in Europe and the war in the Ukraine with the Russian Federation, where forces are targeting dams and water systems in Ukraine, including the destruction of dams like the Makroyali River dam to hinder counter offensive. Then move to Gaza, the Israeli-Palestine conflict that resulted in not only the worst humanitarian crisis we have seen in recent times, but also attacks on water infrastructure and the consequences emerging out of that, including water shortages, eventually water becoming undrinkable. Move to West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Ethiopia, Nigeria, but also Horn of Africa, Somalia, Kenya. In these countries, we've all experienced conflicts between herders and farmers over resources, and that includes water. And now climate change induced droughts tend to catalyze these tensions. They contribute to displacements eventually. But it's not, water-related conflicts are not only happening in Africa or currently in the Middle East. And I mentioned Europe already. The Colorado River, the river's declining water levels is, I think, a good example from the US. And perhaps, Greg, in this conversation, you'll pick that one up at some point. The most recent example that I found quite striking that made it through the news is actually the Paraguay River, that has significantly declined in decades, reached a low level that hasn't been seen for decades. Now, fisher folks blame the rice farmers for their irrigation. Rice farmers blame the government. The government says it's actually climate change. So there's nothing we can do about it. So these are all kind of examples where you can see how complex the relations between climate, water, and conflicts. And given these examples, we are wondering, have these water-related conflicts actually increased? And if yes, do countries and the international community sufficiently tackle them? Now, I'm extremely pleased to introduce to you two renowned experts on the topic. Dr. Linus Mofor. Hi, Linus. Welcome on the panel. You're a regional advisor on sustainability and climate change for East and Southern Africa at UNICEF. We've just missed each other in Nairobi, so you're calling in from Nairobi. Most welcome. And then we have Dr. Annette Huber-Lee, who is a senior scientist at this Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, the US chapter. And Annette, most welcome. Thanks for joining the panel. You have more than 20 years of professional experience in international and domestic planning and management of environmental and water resources, and we all look forward to your insights. The conversation will be chaired by Greg Sixt, who is the director of the Fact Alliance at J-WAFS at MIT. Greg, you're calling in from Boston. And we are here with Sebastian Fiebiger, who is our tutor at BOKU. He will orchestrate and moderate the conversation in the chat. So please post your perspectives, ask questions, and Sebastian, you will come in once in a while and share those with the panel. And as I ask my first opening question to the panel, I'll also move to the background and leave the room to you. But Greg, as I move to the background, I mean, the question that really bothers me is the water-related conflict incidents. Have they actually increased, or is this just are these just stories that we tell us? Now, if they have increased, why is that so? Greg, over to you.
It's a great question. Leave us with Michael. Thank you, and thank you, Annette and Linus, for joining us. I'm going to take Michael's question and hand it off to you. Annette, you're unmuted, so I'll hand it to you first. Have we seen an increase in water-related conflicts, or is it more, oftentimes the narrative is more that they create instability and less actually direct conflict. So if you don't mind speaking to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. In my personal experience, my answer would be yes. I work in Central Asia, and there actually was a physical battle around access to water resources. I think sometimes we see less than you would expect, mostly because of power dynamics. There's one side that clearly has much more power, and it's hard for those with less power, and Gaza and the West Bank come to mind in this case. It becomes more subtle conflict, but I think we're seeing more, and I think we will see more, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, thanks. Linus, do you want to respond to that as well?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with Annette there. We do see a lot of that, particularly in the case of Africa, that has a very high water dependency ratio, which means that the freshwater resources of the country depend on water coming in from other countries or into that country. And we can take a major water resource like the Nile that supports over 300 million people. It's a very, very important water resource. And we know, for example, that there is conflict or tension between riparian countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, which is building the Grand Renaissance Dam, and so on. So all of these conflicts exist on the use of water. And we can see this also in other areas like the Lake Chad Basin, which is a very, very big resource that is shared by more than 5 countries mainly. And again, very, very vulnerable to climate change. And that causes or induces a lot of conflict because it's a very, very shallow water basin and with lots of piezometric domes, which means that there are places where you find it difficult to find groundwater, other places where you might be able to find groundwater, and that groundwater is coupled to the surface water, but the surface water is very sensitive to climatic variations, and therefore the options for conflict become very, very high.
Thank you both. I'm gonna build off this, and I'm gonna focus on water scarcity first, but I don't want to. I want to put it out there at the beginning that the other side of climate and water is too much water. Peak flow events. So feel free to adapt this as need be. But I want to start with water scarcity and the competing demands. For household use, agriculture, industry, energy. How do those competing demands affect human security, especially in some of the work you've done? Annette, you mentioned some conflict in Central Asia over it. What are those? Is that competing demands, or is it literally just water for agriculture? What are you seeing in that?
Yeah, it's competing demands. It's water for hydropower versus water for irrigation, and a lot of trade-offs around those two. I mean, it's sort of globally, water for human consumption is ideally prioritized, or at least, in most policies, it's prioritized, whether it's actually implemented as an issue. But I think you get these bigger players. Sometimes it's mining, farming, agriculture. And in the case of Central Asia, it's really water for energy versus water for agriculture. But I think this, as we look at sort of global temperatures, I'll put in the chat like a nice little video that just shows, year after year after year, we're seeing higher temperatures. And those carry over to the ocean. I mean, you see that same trend that we see in air temperature carries over into oceans, which lead to these stronger events, and I believe will lead to more breakdown, like will exacerbate hunger, exacerbate poverty, and even ecological breakdowns, I think, are likely in the future with no action.
Yeah. I mean, even in the U.S., speaking of water scarcity, you mentioned ecological breakdowns, the Great Salt Lake, right? I mean, that's drying up. That's an ecological disaster waiting to happen when that saline lake becomes exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Linus, I want to give you a chance to respond too, to these competing demands. What are you seeing in Africa in terms of that type of tension between different use cases for water?
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, exactly. Again, the Nile is a classic example where for a country like Ethiopia, the main use, which is the Renaissance Dam, is for energy generation. But for Egypt, for example, it is mainly for agriculture. And so those increasing tensions are there. If you take other water basins, there is also the increasing conflict in demand. But I think once you bring in the idea of integrated transboundary water resource management, then this no longer become conflict, right? It becomes opportunities for countries working together on how to avoid conflict, resolve conflict. I give another example is the Zambezi water basin. That is a very, very important resource that serves countries in Southern Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on. And it is used for power generation, the Kariba Dam, but it is also used for agriculture and for water supply and so on. And therefore, and it is also the most sensitive river basin in the region from climatic impact. In fact, with the World Bank and the Economic Commission for Africa, where I was, the African Climate Policy Center, where I was before, we did a study called Enhancing the Climate Resilience of Africa's Infrastructure. And that study showed that for the Zambezi, depending on which climate situation we have, because we are not sure where the climate ambition in terms of emission reductions will end up, we could have a situation where the Zambezi actually loses up to 60% of its hydropower production potential. Not to talk about the impacts now on agriculture, water supply, and other stuff. That was in 2015 when the report was published. And as you know, later on that year and in 2016, we had a very unusual El Nino that actually affected that water basin very, very dramatically, to the extent that the water level in the Kariba Dam dropped down to 12%. So that is a very big dramatic. But because it is a managed transboundary resource, it means that the countries had to work together to deal with it, right? But that could have been a classic case of conflict because climate change has happened. The water resource has diminished dramatically. There are big needs for energy, big needs for agriculture, and then who now gets what? You know? And this is the big question. When we have these resources and there are tensions caused by climate change, the question of who gets what becomes important. And we also see that in water basins on the continent,
And you mentioned the transboundary, and a little later, we're going to start to get into some of the solutions, and we're going to dive into some of the transboundary examples of transboundary management. So I'm glad you said that, and we're going to come back to that. So one thing I want to unpack a little bit is the role of climate change in this, right? Oftentimes, as you both know, part of my PhD was on water as well, and one thing we often heard is there's no shortage of water. It's just that it's allocation and it's management challenges, right? It's ultimately it's governance challenges. Is climate really is climate the driver of these challenges, or is climate just exacerbating in making bad management choices worse.
Mhm.
And that,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's revealing the problems with governance, to be perfectly honest.
Mhm.
These are mostly solvable problems. If cooperation was possible, I could give one example of work I did in Lesotho in South Africa, the Lesotho Highlands Development Commission. The treaty between Lesotho and South Africa was 35 years ago, no consideration of climate change. And a question about, can Lesotho still deliver this water with climate change? And then meanwhile, Lesotho is asking for some of that water to be diverted to stay in Lesotho. Quite contentious issue. This actually builds off the report that you mentioned, Linus. It was a follow-on project for the resilience of Africa and climate change. And we were able to show actually the diversions are quite resilient to climate change, and the diversion to Lesotho is so tiny given the scale. It really wasn't a problem. So I think this is like to what extent are we willing to sort of sit down together? It's like, let's look at the evidence, see if this is a problem, as opposed to immediately jumping to the conclusion this is a win-lose.
right.
And it's often the case, it's not necessarily a win-lose.
Yeah, I mean, as part of my PhD was in water diplomacy, right? And one of the core concepts of water diplomacy is that water is a flexible resource, right? It's not a zero-sum game, that there actually are mutual gains. I have a question about the Lesotho example. Were the allocations, and I'm going to tie this back to the Colorado River Basin in a second, were the allocations percentages or absolute volumes?
Yeah, in this case, absolute volumes, so it's a
Really?
contract. Lesotho has to deliver a certain volume, or they get royalties from South Africa for that water, and they would get less royalties if they don't deliver that specific quantity of water. So it's quite different than when you get into the Western US, where you have these senior, junior water rights.
Yeah, but yet the similarity with the Colorado River Basin is that the water was allocated in a wet decade, a historically wet decade, right?
Yeah.
And it was allocated in absolute amounts, right? So
Yeah.
Colorado gets X cubic, acres of water, and Arizona gets X cubic, and so basically that's a situation where they over allocated, they allocated more water than is actually in the river on an average year, and but there's this legal, I'm supposed to get this amount, which is absolutely insane, which is where we use that as an example in the water diplomacy studies of, if it had been a percentage of volume, a percentage of flow, then you could be just. You could treat that water as a flexible resource. Linus, I didn't mean to step in. I'm not a panelist, but this is a topic I'm so passionate about. So
no, very important, very important, very important. Yeah. No, it's very important, and I agree. Climate change, of course, exposes the weaknesses in water governance, right? Because when there is abundance and there is no need to think about scarcity, then people don't really worry so much. But when climate change is coming in, as it is the case in many parts of Africa, for example, then people start getting concerned about who is getting what. But there is another dimension to this, and to say, when you bring in, again, I know we talk a bit more about transboundary and so on in the bigger context, that if you take like the Nile, you have the Nile Basin Initiative. We take the Chad Basin, you have the Chad Basin Commission, and these are all intergovernmental bodies that are supposed to do integrated management of these resources and so on. But still it is a challenge, because one philosophy which seems to be coming up as a way of addressing this issue of scarcity and conflict is to say that rather than say who gets what, and so if the water resource is being used in one part for energy generation, that energy should be available to all the other countries as well. Is being used in one part for agriculture, then the food production in that area should also be available to the other countries. Therefore, it really doesn't matter who is getting what. It's more about how do we utilize these important resources for our common good. Benefit sharing becomes very, very important as a way of dealing with this.
So almost more regional strategic planning, where if we're using this water for agriculture and this is being used for energy, let's develop, we're in the same basin, let's develop regional approaches.
Exactly.
Before we get into kind of some of the solutions, actually, I also want to remind the audience, there's a Q&A box or Q&A tab you can click and please ask questions, because we're going to pause in a few minutes and start. I'm going to have Sebastian dive into some of the questions from the audience. So please feel free to ask some questions. But one of the things I want to get into a little bit more before we start to look at some of the solutions is, we've talked about how climate change is a force multiplier for bad governance or imperfect governance. And, so it can almost be a surprise when it happens, but it's been there the whole time, a slow surprise, right? So if we were to kind of look for signs of where the breakdowns could be likely or where the weak points would be, what are some of those signs that you would look for when you say, hey, if in 10 years this is going to be a problem, or if there's flooding, this is going to be a problem? Like, what are some of these signs that you see as these indicators that we should be paying more attention to? Hopefully that's not too much of a curveball I threw at the group.
Yeah, but actually it is, but I think there's a bigger context of the conflict, Greg, right? Because we just came back from COP29 in Baku, and we know the ambition was very, very disappointing, right? And if we take countries like in Africa that have contributed the least to the emissions that have causing climate change, no matter what they do, if the other countries are not making significant effort to reduce their emissions, it means that the water stress that they will feel will continue to get higher and higher, right? So even if they had the governance approach right, even if they had the idea that it's regional integration, is our common resource, right, we will do it together, but the conflict of the countries that are supposed to follow the fundamental principle of the convention, the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities to ensure that they make more effort to reduce emissions, then lead them to know where, right? So I think this is one angle that we really need to bring into this conversation, to say, yes, we can identify the challenges and the potential areas of problems with these water resources, but what do we do when the countries that are causing the emissions are not making enough efforts to reduce these emissions so that the scarcity issues no longer become an issue? Water use in Africa, a lot in agriculture. Most of Africa depends on rain-fed agriculture. With climate change, what does that mean then? With the water scarcity, reduce agricultural productivity. Over 60 to 70% of people depend on agriculture. So all of this now becomes a different level of cascading the conflict and so on. So whilst we're looking at, yes, we have limited resources, climate changes, and we need some governance arrangements to manage these resources, but the biggest challenge is not reducing the emissions. And at the moment, global emissions are not reducing. So we really must bring this idea of responsibility in reducing emissions on how we address the water scarcity issue, because then that cascades into agricultural productivity, it then cascades into food security, it then cascades into nutrition because children don't have enough food to eat and so on. Something, all of these complex issues all come in because of this conflict about who is not making enough effort to reduce emissions, even if we had governance challenges on how we use and allocate water resources.
So even the best laid plans get thrown off by these emissions. And that, sorry, I didn't mean to. Please go ahead.
No, I can build off that. I'm really glad you brought in this sort of global perspective, because I think it's, absolutely the countries with the most emissions need to do more. If I had it in my power, I would certainly do that. I mean, I think the scale of conflict is going to increase. So we think of water as a local problem. And I think that's becoming more and more untrue. I think as things escalate, as we see more food insecurity, more increased poverty because of this, displaced people. I mean, I think we're going to see migration on a scale we've never imagined is going to happen, and we're ill prepared for that. And I think somehow the global community really has to do more in that. You know, I was actually thinking about this today. You know, we talk about climate policy, but I think when we think of what does climate policy really mean when you get to low and middle income countries, I think we should be thinking more about economic development policy. How do we help these countries get through, you know, the direction that we're headed, which is very bleak? And I think the global community really needs to step in to prevent what I imagine would be much more global water problems.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, I want to point out two things here too. One thing that I think we default to talk about is surface water, right? And I think the other shoe to drop is going to be groundwater, because that is, I mean, that is being over extracted around the world, and in many places it's not being well monitored. And when that's gone, oh, that's going to be a real problem. And actually, you know, an example of Annette, your comment about actually this ties both Linus and Annette's comments about conflict and kind of national planning. I think to Jordan, right? Jordan has had numerous national plans for how they're going to manage some of their groundwater resources. They had a long-term plan for one of the aquifers in the northern part, that, you know, near Syria, and then the Syrian war happened, and they had 2 million refugees, and all of a sudden a plan that was supposed to be a 30-year plan turned into like a 10-year plan because you had 2 million more people drawing on the water, right? And that's where how regional impacts and how, you know, conflict and you know, climate as well can really feed into this perfect storm. So I see we have one question. I want to get a couple more on the. No, we've got two. There we go. I want to get a couple more on the board before we pause and ask for that. Michael, I want to give you a chance to chime in with a question, because you've been listening, and if you want to ask a question, if not, I'm putting you on the spot. But if not, no worries.
I'm supposed to stay in the background.
I know, but you're here, and you know, this is a really interesting conversation. So I figured I wanted to give you a chance to ask a question.
No, it is. I mean, Annette and Linus, my mind still sticks to kind of signs of vulnerability. How can we actually tell that a system develops cracks and becomes more vulnerable to climate shocks? And I've heard you both saying, no, it's actually mitigation. We also have to speak about it. It's good that you made that big emphasis, but it's how do we recognize that, hey, we are moving into the wrong direction with regard to climate-induced tensions?
No, absolutely. You know, I mentioned earlier, Michael, about this study that we did with the World Bank on enhancing the climate resilience of Africa's infrastructure. And when we found some of this, of course, as I think you also mentioned, Greg, and you mentioned, Michael, that Annette, that climate change does not only mean that you have less water, right? In some places, climate change is causing a lot more water than you can manage, right? And so we then said, with these findings that are really, really staggering, what should happen? Should we just stay and throw our hands up and say, well, this is it, or what? So we decided with the World Bank and the African Union and African Development Bank, with support from the Nordic Development Fund, to establish something called the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, which means that when you start looking at these water resources, for any investments that you want to make, you first do a serious climate analysis of the different scenarios that are likely to happen. And then based on that, you can then say, okay, so what additional investments do you need to make to ensure that climate, because we don't know which one will happen, but under the boundary of the possibilities, that this investment will have the least regret, so that whatever climate change happens, we know that we will have the security that's needed. We know that the investments would work, and we know that the infrastructure will work, and so on. So that becomes then important on how we look at this. But then if you also look at the fact that you have so many, and globally, I'm sure it's the same in Asia and everywhere else, you have these transboundary water bodies, right? But I don't think enough is being done to invest in them or support them to actually do more of the hard questions along the lines of what you're asking, Michael, and say, look, are we really sure that we will be okay in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years? Who should do what to be, for us to be comfortable that we will be okay, right? I think that is a bit missing, and I think this is where maybe the science community can come in together with investments in climate information services, because if we don't know, if we don't measure and have enough data to be able to kind of like create early warnings, to be able to create early warnings of water stress challenges, then I think we'll be in big problems. But I don't think we have those, because even where you have the most sensitive water resources like Lake Chad Basin, where there's very little effort being made to kind of like give these signals of where we are likely to have problems and what should be done now, so that the responsible authorities can begin to reach out to say, look, our food security will decrease by this amount if we don't do something now. And if that food security decreases by this amount, it means that nutrition level will go down by this amount. It means that many more children will go hungry and many more children will be stunted. And as I say, if you have stunted children now, it means stunted economies later. But I don't think these big dynamic pictures are being asked at the moment. And I think this is an opportunity where programs like this can facilitate these big questions to be asked, right? The big questions, the big scenarios. What if, you know? So that's what I would.
And Linus, Greg, and Annette, and then I pull back again and into the background. And I would probably also look for the existence of conflict resolution mechanisms and the robustness of institutions, the existence of peace committees that are sufficiently transboundary in nature, and so that when things getting tough, because communities can't tackle what you guys do at the COP, and we constantly keep failing in these negotiations. So there need to be measures at local level too, no? And I guess conflict resolution mechanisms are one of those.
Yeah, I could give a couple of examples. Like one is, how do we recognize ahead of time that there's a vulnerable position? We do, and as Ken in the Q&A and Linus, a lot of robust decision approaches where we look at a wide range of potential climate projections, but also other kind of deep uncertainties like major diversions upstream, political and economic interruptions, and try to find those weak spots in the system, looking 20, 30 years ahead, and choose to introduce policies or infrastructure that, in theory, increase the resilience of those systems. And I think when you get at this idea of like a peace committee, I find that the international donors often have a shorter term level of investment. I mean, I think to get these kind of peace committees or effective river basin commissions, it's decades. It's decades of investment, and we're just not seeing that sufficiently, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that is a common thread throughout so much development work in general, is just these 5-year project cycles. It's like just as things start to catch, the funding dries up, and you have a reflexivity failure and things just collapse. We're not getting any more questions at the moment, but we do have a couple questions from our esteemed colleague Ken Stresbeck, who is a water expert in his own right. And so he asked about how we the climate impacts for Africa are highly uncertain, right? I mean, a lot of the granularity we need in our modeling just isn't there in parts of Africa, for the sub-regional variability. So how do we plan for that type of uncertainty? If it's, I mean, you can, if you get it wrong, you can be really maladaptive, right? You could come up with a solution that you think is going to be great, and then, whoa, are you wrong? And that has an impact on thousands of lives. How do we build in adaptability for the types of uncertainty?
Yeah, I like the way Ken phrased, and nice to hear from you, Ken. The use of water for food security versus energy security, because we talk about cooperation around water, which gives you a certain set of shared benefits. But when we expand to look at the benefits derived from both hydropower, food security, industrial security, it kind of expands the sharing that can happen. And I think, Linus, you kind of alluded to this as well, that and increasingly in our work, we're linking energy system models with water system models that allow us to explore this broader set of space. Can we trade food for energy? And increasingly also we're linking our work to macroeconomic models so that we kind of raise the attention to the level of a minister of finance or the prime minister for some of the work we're doing in Rwanda, that these have really important macroeconomic implications. And if we don't look at some of these synergies that I see can be challenges or opportunities. I'm an optimist, so I tend towards the opportunity side of things. The biggest challenge being, I'm sorry, I'll say this again, the power dynamics. Even within a country, to get the Ministry of Energy to talk to the Ministry of Water, to talk to the Ministry of Agriculture is often very challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, Linus, do you want to respond to that?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with Annette, and thank you very much, Ken, for the question. Extremely important, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in this area. And I know that especially globally, but especially for Africa, because Africa is very much in your heart. But you're right, I fully also agree. Annette, you mentioned earlier that we really also need to look at this from an economic development perspective, right? At the end of the day, we need to think about it from development perspective. So you need to industrialize, you need to transform agriculture, you need to have energy for all of these things. And all of these have water implications. And therefore, with climate uncertainty, the only way, I think, is to ensure that there is, back to your issue, Greg, about governance, that there is a well-thought-out governance approach, which is underpinned by the focus on regional integration, right? And underpinned by the principle of benefit sharing, to say that, yes, if we're doing all of this together, with the uncertainties that are there, so long as we're all doing this together, therefore we can always be pitching. We look like in Africa, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade, right, which is the biggest trading bloc when it's fully operational, that allow things to move from one part of the continent to the other. Therefore, if the uncertainty is saying that, look, we are not sure whether we'll have enough water to continue to grow this amount of, let's say, maize in this part of Africa, but we have enough, or the modeling and analysis show that we have enough to grow more maize in this other part of Africa, and then it shouldn't be a problem, because you know that where the maize is grown and with the free trade and free movement, everybody on the continent will have maize to eat, right? So I think we use the issue of regional integration, benefit sharing, and so on as a way of buffering resilience under uncertainty, particularly in terms of the uncertainty of climate change. But then that requires political meeting of the minds and so on, which is another level of challenge.
Well, you just hit it right there, Linus. I mean, one of the challenges with these regional approaches, though, is a reluctance. So to have a regional approach requires a certain amount of accepting that you are ceding a bit of your sovereignty as a nation, right? That's the reason why the EU works, right? Because there's these agreements. So, I mean, I'm really curious if you have any, I mean, this is, I mean, Nobel Prize is coming your way if you can answer this question. How do we address these challenges where countries are reluctant to, to give up their, not to give up, but to open up their agricultural planning, if to say, oh, maize isn't going to work for us. I have my trust that we are going to be able to trade maize with you when you grow it, because we're going to do this energy trading with you. I mean, how do you cross that bridge? Annette, do you have any thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something that's curious to me in Africa, and I'm maybe a little bit out of date on this, but there are across the whole continent this concept of 5 power pools, and that you would share across many countries and southern, western, eastern, northern, central. And why is it that we are willing to talk about power pool sharing, but not food sharing on that same level? Because you do give up some sovereignty when you're part of a power pool, but you gain resilience, right? That's the, and my fantasy, as we see our resilience decreasing, we would be able to see the value of joint resilience as opposed to me as a country being food self-sufficient, energy self-sufficient, and I can just, be out, independent of the world, which, after COVID, we saw a little tendency that way. How can we get back to this idea of the value of that we all benefit with a little bit of this, we share the risk, but we share the benefits.
And that you even made me think of Texas's independent power grid and how they're not part of sharing the power grid in the US in one country. This actually, normally we would break and have the Q&A come in. We'd have Sebastian answer questions, but I've just been integrating these questions into the conversation because it's flowing so well. So Susan Murcott asked a question where that actually feeds into where I was going to go with this is there a way to expand supply, right? So a question that has come up a lot with the students in the class is, what about desal? Is that a solution? And so let's dive in a bit to expanding supply, because we've talked a lot about how current supply can be flexible, right? And oftentimes like urban water is mostly non-consumptive, right? Urban water can be reused, but agricultural water use is much more consumptive. What are some of the technologies? What are some of the approaches for expanding supply? Linus, I'll go to you first.
Okay. No. Thank you very much, Greg. And I think it's a very important question, and I think in fact it actually also builds on the point that Annette was finishing with about seeing the bigger picture, right? I would say just like with energy, where you say that a good energy policy is an all of the above options, but it doesn't mean that they're all equal in terms of which ones you go for. And it doesn't mean that everybody does the same. So a good water policy would be an all of the above policy where you're looking at all options, desalination technology-focused options, nature-based options, conservation options, and so on. But things will be different at different times and in different countries under different circumstances. So I think looking at it from this perspective is saying that technology has a big role to play, nature has a big role to play, but all of this is underpinned by good governance and also going beyond boundaries and yielding that sovereignty that we mentioned to know that, you might think that you're being protective of yourself, but you're actually making yourself more vulnerable and less resilient by not looking at the broader picture. So, and all of the above approach. Of course, desalination would be good, but then there are cost implications. There are other challenges of what do you do with the salt at the end and so on. But yes, for sure, it should be an all of the above. And then we look at specific circumstances of situations, say which options work best, which combination of options work best for a given situation.
Yeah, I think that's an important point too, Linus, because relying on technology alone is a fool's errand, right? It's got to be the combination. Annette, what are I know you do a lot of food, water, energy nexus work. So I feel like this is in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, and a lot of work in the Middle East where water is extremely scarce and desal really is on the table, right? It's almost unavoidable with increasing population. But where I'm really pushing right now in the Middle East is yes to desal, but you should marry that with wastewater reuse. And what you get as a result is, and if that's reused in agriculture as opposed to reused for, golf, you get a very resilient agricultural system. So you see because people tend to use the same amount of water, and then farmers have a predictable water supply throughout the year, that they can take it in these very sunny areas. I mean, unfortunately, we have to talk about heat and all the problems with that and evaporation. But I think marrying those two solutions is, and if done properly, of course, you have to treat the wastewater. So, I mean, there are cases where you have untreated reuse of wastewater, which of course I'm in no way, shape or form advocating. But I think there's a place where technology can really make a difference. And the cost of desal is coming down. And you see in Morocco, you know, having the power source be solar. So instead of like a fossil fuel based desal, try to make it a renewable source for desal.
Yeah, before the war, I had spent some time in Syria, and they were developing a whole area outside of Aleppo that was going to be wastewater irrigated. However, it was partially treated, and the water was definitely, I mean, would have led to some long-term challenges with the soil. I think it's one. I mean, do either of you know the extent to which we are able to? You know, we've got these emerging pollutants, right, that end up in our wastewater now. We've got things like, you know, forever chemicals, PFAS and PFOS, and that's the extent of my chemistry knowledge, and microplastics. I mean, is our water treatment sufficient enough where we can, you know, I know it is potentially in a very wealthy country, right? But do we have the technology to be able to treat water that we're not potentially poisoning the land for the future? I think the answer is yes, but how accessible is that?
What cost?
But what cost and what kind of capacity? Because to do tertiary treatment requires more equipment, more. I mean, I like what you had said, Linus, about, you know, everything's on the table. So let's see how far we can go avoiding sort of, I don't want to say avoiding wastewater reuse, because I still think that's
and I wasn't implying that,
but yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, nature-based solutions should be like really high. I mean, we haven't talked about floods. But if you ask me what's the most scary thing where it keeps me up at night, are these extreme events, you know, over a meter of water.
Let's talk about floods.
It's just, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And I think if we did more, you know, around, you know, small dams, like, you know, that hold the water and let it seep into the groundwater, which I know Susan Murcat, thanks for being here. You know, check dams, that sort of thing, as well as, you know, soil conservation. I mean, I feel like this should be number one, you know, especially in my work in Africa, and also in the Middle East. I mean, let's do something about these extreme flood events.
This actually ties in with the earlier. So this is the last in the series of food, land, and water. And so this ties in, and we've been talking to the class that this is a part of a lot about how these are all interrelated. Clearly, we've made the case that food is very related to this. We've talked about that today. And then on the nature-based solutions, land clearly is. I mean, if we make the land resilient, our communities and our societies and our land is resilient to floods too, and more resilient to droughts. In the last 10 minutes, I want to touch a bit, come back to the transboundary, because I said I was going to. And, you know, Linus, you were formerly with UN Economic Commission for Africa. I know UN Economic Commission for Europe has the water. We lost Annette. Hopefully she'll come back. She's back. I know UNECE has the water
convention
treaty. Thank you.
Water convention.
The water convention. Are there examples of where we're seeing effective transboundary water collaboration?
Yeah, no, before I go to that, Greg, I mean, just go back to one of the things Annette mentioned on the demand side, because this is really important. Because I don't think there is enough effort being made onto efficient water usage. And when we don't use water efficiently, then the supply has to go up. And when the supply is going up, so then there's big room for conflict. So I think we really need to make a lot more effort on promoting water efficiency, whether it is at home, industry, or even in agriculture, a more water efficient agricultural system, a more water efficient industry, and also, of course, more water efficient use at home. But of course, for more water efficient use at home, then we also have to think about other complexities, which means, for example, where you have pipe drainage systems, you really need to have enough water flowing through the system to be sure that things are being flushed out, because then otherwise you have other health impacts, because things are piling up in the pipes and the heat because of climate and all of that stuff. But going back to the question then, yes, the ECE and we all work together, all the regional commissions work with the ECE, the Economic Commission for Europe, under this water convention, and the commissions all work together to really promote and have regional approaches or regional understanding, common approaches in the regions on how to do transboundary water management and use. Yeah, so that is ongoing. It is a very, very important initiative, and we really appreciate the work that is being led by the sister commission in Geneva in managing this process. And I think it is through that important process where everybody is speaking with one voice. All governments have to have a common understanding on the transboundary water issues that affect the regions, and signing up to the principles of the convention that the countries that sign up to it, ratified it, have to live up to it. And then I think that's a very, very important way to promote more uptake of the water convention as a way of really managing water stress under climate change conditions. Yeah.
And are there, and I'll leave this to Annette and you, I mean, are there, can you point to examples of really successful transboundary water governance? And if you can, what's making that work?
I would say when countries see the common benefit and they have the benefit sharing, everybody feels that they're getting something out of it. Huh? Yeah. When hegemony exists in these water basins, then there's always going to be a problem. There has to be no big brother, small brother, big sister, small sister. It needs to be a system of water use. It doesn't matter who is using how much, but it should be that everybody feels that we're all having a share of what we need from it, right? It shouldn't be about that if we have, if we are 5 of us, we should all have 20%, no, but just that everybody should feel that they're having the benefit from it, and that benefit is being shared across the board. And I think that's a very important underpinning principle to ensure that we can have transboundary water governance that works for everybody, especially under the increasing threats of climate change.
Annette, even more broadly, do you want to chime in on any sort of your thoughts on some of the, successful transboundary water governance, or what do you think is needed to make it work? Oh, you're muted.
So I wish I could point to successes.
Yeah.
I just started working in.
Oh, we just lost Annette again. And Linus, you're muted as well. We seem to have some stability issues on the internet. Here, you're back.
Annette is back.
Yeah. Sorry, my internet's unstable. I just started working in Iraq, and it's all about the upstream diversions and the Tigris in Euphrates, and just as you said, Linus, there's no feeling of equity, right? And the work I do in West Bank and Gaza, Jordan, I mean, there's also no sense of equitable allocations. And what does it take to get there? I mean, it's interesting in the case of Jordan and Israel. I mean, things are too unstable right now, but just before the war, there was a negotiation about Israel delivering more water to Jordan. In exchange, Jordan would send more solar power to Israel. But you can see like a conflict emerges, and everything falls apart.
Yeah.
So how do we, I think again, it takes this long-term view, right? Is to keep trying to build those. Sometimes it's just scientist to scientist. Keep the relationships in these countries where at least the technical people are talking to each other through these very difficult events, and maybe somewhere they turn out to be ministers down the road, and can find some common ground. I think it's the ability to see the human in the other. That this is not just my we tend to otherize people as opposed to humanizing each other.
Yeah, I think one of the examples, I believe it's the Indus River Treaty, which has survived 2 wars between India and Pakistan. And I think that management, I believe that's the treaty. You know, this is on the record. This is being recorded. So if I'm wrong, forgive me. But I believe it is the Indus River Treaty. That I think, as you know, that coordination continued despite, you know, and through the 2 wars. So I'm looking at the time. We got 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna this went fast.
Yeah.
So I personally want to thank you both for a really wonderful chat. This is one, obviously this is a topic that's close to my heart. I want to give you both, you know, a minute if you'd like to kind of close us out for what you want to say, but then I'll hand it back to Michael. Michael, I'm not quite sure how you want to close us out here, so.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it was 10.
No, I'll share my summaries in a minute. Yeah, my takeaways. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, Annette and Linus, your closing thoughts, if you'd like to.
No. I just want to fully agree with especially the last point that Annette made. Let's keep this science-based. Let's keep the scientists talking to each other, because it is through the evidence base of the issues that we have, whether it's the impacts of climate, whether it's the rules of allocation, what the impacts are, and so on. So long as we keep the scientists and the technical people talking to each other, and then making concerted effort to have this bridging between the science and policy interface, because I think the politicians, they make their decisions based on biases, but with concerted effort from scientists and technical people from across different boundaries, across countries, across different fields of thought and so on, when they have a concerted evidence-based thing to influence the policy, I think we would be on a right path to get water governance, especially under changing climate, right. Thank you.
Thank you, Linus. Thank you. Annette?
Yeah, building on what Linus said, I mean, I think it's science, and it's science to policy. And at least for me, where I am in my career, I really want to do much more to that policy engagement and thinking creatively, doing more with the macroeconomics so that we elevate water in these discussions. But I would love to hear from anybody how we as scientists can do more to really influence policy across all these scales, from the global down to the local. Like I think we have to be relentless on this point.
Thank you. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. I learned a lot about the multiple dimensions of water. So thanks for this conversation. My key takeaway actually is the following. I mean, as much as we need to get our head around on how to fix things downstream, and do more preparedness and get ready for what is knocking on the door. And we spoke about displacement and water-related jobs that are very likely to increase in future, and will ripple through our food systems eventually, and societies. As much as we have to prepare for that, we have to get the mitigation right. And that means much more upstream work. Otherwise, and you haven't mentioned so, but that's kind of what I make out of it. We get stuck in the blame the victim framing of things, and ignoring where the problem comes from.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's only so much you can adapt. There's there's boundaries within which you can adapt, and after that, so we have to get the mitigation right too.
So thank you very much. That's it. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's really a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, my colleagues.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye. And to everyone out there from wherever you called in.
Thank you.